Chris, man. Hey, Chris. Hey, Chris. 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 Hey, Chris. Hey, Chris. Hey, Chris. Chris. Hey, Chris. Yo, Chris. Hey, Chris. 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 Hey, Chris. Hey, Chris. 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 Yo, hey, Chris. 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 Hey, Chris. Chris. Hey, Chris. 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 Hey, Chris. Hey, Chris. 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 Yo, Chris, you there? Hey, Chris. Hey, Chris. Yo, Chris. 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 Hey, Chris. Chris. I can't hear you, man. Chris. Turn up your mic. Hey, Chris. Chris, turn up your mic. Mic check? Chris. 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 Hey, Chris, you there? Chris? NZ Chris? 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 Hey, Chris, you there? Chris? 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 Hey, Chris? 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 Hey, Chris? Hey, Chris? 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 Hey, Chris? 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 Hey, Chris? Chris? Yo, NZ Chris? Hey, Chris? Yo, Chris, man? Hey, Chris? Chris? Hey, Chris, what up? Hey, Chris? 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 Hey, Chris? Chris? Chris, you there? Hey, Chris? 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 Chris, you there? Chris? Yo, Chris? Hey, Chris? 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 Chris, you there? Hey, Chris, you there? Chris? Chris? Hey, Chris? 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 Yo, Chris, what up, man? Hey, Chris?